Have you ever felt completely alone, as if the world has turned its back on you? Isolation can feel like a heavy burden, a dark tunnel with no light at the end. But what if I told you that this solitude isn't a punishment, but a divine setup? Today we're diving deep into the profound purpose of isolation, a concept that might just change the way you see your life. In this speech, we'll uncover why God isolates you, not to harm you, but to shape you into something extraordinary. We'll explore how solitude has been a critical turning point for some of the most remarkable figures in the Bible: Moses in the wilderness, Joseph in the prison, and even Jesus in the desert. Their stories aren't ancient relics, they're blueprints for how God works in our lives today. This isn't just a theoretical journey. Together we'll navigate the steps to understand how isolation refines your soul, clears the noise of the world, and prepares you for a purpose far greater than you can imagine. Along the way, we'll confront the mistakes we make, like trying to escape solitude or fix situations on our own mistakes that can delay or even derail God's perfect plan for us. Imagine Moses tending sheep in the desert, unaware that God was preparing him to lead a nation. Think of Joseph, betrayed and imprisoned, yet positioned perfectly to save millions from famine. And picture Jesus fasting in the wilderness, facing temptation yet emerging with clarity and power for his ministry. These moments of isolation weren't detours, they were divine appointments. As we journey through this, you'll learn to embrace the silence, to listen for God's voice in the stillness, and to recognize the sacred work happening behind the scenes of your solitude. If this resonates with you, like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to our channel for more content that illuminates the mysteries of God's work in your life. And don't forget to comment below. I'd love to hear your story of how God has worked through your seasons of isolation. Let's build a community that inspires and uplifts one another. Imagine standing in the silence of your own thoughts, the world around you stripped away. No cheering crowd, no comforting companionship, no familiar noise to drown out the fears that bubble to the surface. It feels like abandonment, doesn't it? Yet in these moments of isolation, something divine begins to stir. The truth is, God often isolates you not to harm or punish you, but to prepare you for something greater, a purpose beyond your current understanding. Consider Joseph, thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. From the outside, it seemed as though his life was spiraling into irredeemable chaos. But behind the scenes, God was crafting a masterpiece. Every moment of Joseph's isolation served as preparation for his ultimate calling, to save his family and a nation from famine. In the silence of his prison cell, God was refining Joseph, teaching him wisdom, patience, and faith. In your own life, the pits and prisons might look like a broken relationship, the loss of a job, or a season of loneliness. These moments can feel suffocating, as though you've been cast aside. The mistake is to rush to escape the discomfort, to fill the void with distractions or repairs of your own making. But what if, like Joseph, you're in the middle of a divine preparation? God uses isolation to strip away the noise and idols that obscure his voice. When you're surrounded by the clamor of life, friends, career, constant activity, it's easy to mistake their presence for purpose. But isolation reveals what remains when everything else is gone. It's where God whispers truths that the noise would drown out. Elijah experienced this on Mount Horeb. After fleeing for his life, he found himself alone in a cave, overwhelmed by fear and despair. He expected God to speak through the grand and dramatic, a powerful wind, an earthquake, a fire. But God came in a gentle whisper, a sound that required Elijah to quiet his heart and lean in closely. Isolation creates that space, a sacred pause where God's whisper can cut through the chaos of your life. You might resist this solitude, filling it with endless distractions, scrolling through social media, binge-watching shows, or chasing shallow connections. These actions only delay the work God wants to do in your heart. Instead, embrace the stillness. Let God dismantle the false comforts you've built. Trust that He's using this time to prepare you for something greater than you could imagine. Jesus himself walked through a season of isolation. Before his public ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and facing the temptations of Satan. This isolation wasn't a punishment, it was preparation. Each temptation sharpened his reliance on the Father, grounding him in truth and purpose. If even Jesus needed isolation to ready himself for his mission, how much more do we need it? When you face isolation, resist the urge to see it as rejection. Instead, view it as a divine invitation to step into God's workshop. The silence isn't empty, it's pregnant with purpose. God is stripping away what doesn't belong: pride, fear, dependence on others, so that he can fill you with his Spirit. Like a sculptor chiseling away at a block of stone, he's creating something beautiful, something ready to fulfill his plans. But preparation requires surrender. If you try to repair what God is breaking down, you'll miss the transformation he's offering. This is a lesson the Israelites struggled to learn. When Moses led them out of Egypt, they found themselves isolated in the wilderness, far from the comforts of their old lives. Instead of trusting God's plan, they longed to return to their chains, failing to see the freedom and promise ahead. Don't make the same mistake. Trust that the wilderness is not the end of the story, it's a crucial chapter in your journey toward God's promises. So what can you do? Begin by embracing the quiet. Set aside time each day to sit with God, free from distractions. Open his word and let it speak into your solitude. Pray not just for deliverance, but for understanding and growth. Ask him what he's preparing you for, and trust that his plans are good even when they're hidden. Isolation isn't easy. It feels like the breaking of everything familiar. But in the breaking, God is building. Joseph didn't see the palace from the pit, and you may not see your purpose in the midst of your loneliness. But hold on to this truth. God is not done with you. The silence isn't the end. It's the beginning of something extraordinary. Imagine the stillness of a room where even your breath feels loud, the world outside muted, and your thoughts louder than they've ever been. Isolation has a way of amplifying everything you've been avoiding. In the quiet, there's nowhere to hide, not from your fears, your regrets, or the questions you've buried deep within. And yet this silence, though unnerving, holds the key to something profound: hearing God's voice. Think of Samuel, a young boy lying in the temple as the lamp of God burned low. The stillness of the night became the setting for God's voice to break through, calling his name, not once but repeatedly. 1 Samuel 3. If Samuel had been surrounded by noise, would he have heard it? In the same way, God often waits for the silence to speak to us, but we're so quick to fill it with distractions that we miss his voice entirely. The mistake many of us make is fearing the silence. We rush to fill every moment with noise, scrolling endlessly on our phones, turning up the volume on music, or drowning our thoughts in meaningless chatter. It's as if we're terrified of what the quiet might reveal. But what if the silence isn't something to be feared but embraced? What if it's in that stillness that God wants to meet you? Moses understood this. Before he became the great leader of Israel, he spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep. It was there, in the solitude of the desert, that God appeared to him in a burning bush, commissioning him for a mission that would change history. The wilderness wasn't a punishment, it was preparation. Without the stillness, Moses might never have been ready to hear God's call. In our daily lives, the wilderness might look like a season of loneliness, a break from relationships, or a time when nothing seems to be moving forward. We're tempted to view these moments as setbacks, but they're actually invitations. Invitations to lean into the silence and listen. God's voice doesn't always come in dramatic ways. Like Elijah on Mount Horeb, we often expect him in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. But God's voice comes in the gentle whisper, a sound so subtle that it requires us to stop and be still. This is where so many of us falter. Instead of embracing the quiet, we fight against it. We try to escape it, patch it, or ignore it altogether. We mistake the absence of noise for the absence of God, forgetting that His presence is often found in the spaces we least expect. But there's something else about isolation. It doesn't just amplify God's voice, it also reveals what competes for our attention. The Israelites in the wilderness were stripped of the comforts of Egypt, and in that vulnerability their true hearts were exposed. They grumbled, doubted, and turned to idols, revealing where their trust truly lay. Isolation has a way of doing the same for us. It shows us the idols we built, be it success, relationships, or control, and challenges us to tear them down. This is why isolation is a gift, even though it doesn't feel like one. It forces us to confront what we've been avoiding and to rely fully on God. It's in the quiet that we can discern His direction, His correction, and His comfort. But this requires a shift in perspective. Instead of viewing isolation as abandonment, we must see it as an opportunity to draw closer to Him. Jesus Himself modeled this. Before beginning His ministry, He withdrew to the wilderness for 40 days, fasting and praying. In that time, He faced temptations that tested His identity and mission. Yet it was through that isolation that He emerged stronger, ready to fulfill His purpose. If the Son of God needed solitude to prepare for His calling, how much more do we? So how do we embrace this? Start by creating moments of intentional silence in your day. Turn off the noise literally. Put down your phone, step away from the chaos, and sit with God. Open His Word and let it speak into your heart. Pray not with a list of demands, but with a willingness to listen. And when the silence feels overwhelming, remember that it's in this space that God is working, shaping, and speaking. Isolation isn't easy. It feels like being pruned, stripped of what's familiar and comfortable. But pruning is necessary for growth. Without it, a plant becomes overgrown and unfruitful. In the same way, God uses these seasons to refine us, to strip away what's unnecessary so that we can bear more fruit. Don't rush to escape the silence. Don't fill it with distractions or try to repair what God is breaking down. Instead, trust that He's using this time to prepare you for something greater. Like Samuel, Moses, and Jesus, lean into the quiet and listen. God is speaking. Are you ready to hear Him? Imagine a barren landscape where everything you once leaned on has vanished. It feels desolate, lonely, and maybe even terrifying. This is the season of isolation, and it's not random. It's not a punishment or an accident. It's a precise part of God's redemption plan, a process so intricate and deliberate that it transforms the very fabric of your soul. Think of Joseph, sold into slavery by his brothers and thrown into an Egyptian prison for a crime he didn't commit. The isolation of that dark cell could have crushed him. But what was really happening? God was at work, weaving a story of redemption. That prison became a crucible, refining Joseph into the man who would one day save a nation from famine. Without the years of solitude and suffering, he wouldn't have been ready for the monumental role God had prepared for him. Now look at your own life. When isolation strikes, it feels like rejection. A breakup, a lost job, friendships fading away, it all feels like the world is turning its back on you. But what if that isolation is God's way of pulling you aside, not to harm you, but to save you? What if He's taking you out of the chaos so you can finally hear Him clearly? The mistake is believing the lie that you're abandoned, that the silence means God isn't there. But in truth, the silence is His voice whispering, I'm doing something bigger than you can see. Take Elijah, who fled into the wilderness, broken and terrified, thinking his ministry was over. But in that solitude, God revealed Himself not in the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. It was there in the quiet that Elijah received his next mission. The same is true for us. Isolation isn't the end. It's a reset, a space where God redirects us toward His purpose. In daily life, we often resist this process. We scramble to fix what's been broken, to rebuild relationships, or to force our way out of the quiet. We cling to what's comfortable, even if it's harmful, just to avoid the feeling of being alone. But here's the truth. Trying to repair what God is intentionally dismantling will only delay his plan. You're not meant to rebuild what he's already begun to replace. Jesus' life is the ultimate example of this. Before the cross, he withdrew to the Garden of Gethsemane, isolating himself even from his closest disciples. He prayed alone, wrestling with the weight of what was coming. That moment of solitude wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a critical step in the redemption of humanity. Without the isolation of the garden, there wouldn't have been the victory of the resurrection. The same pattern is true for us. The isolation you're enduring now is part of a bigger story, a pathway to something far greater. But how do you endure it without falling into despair? Start by changing your perspective. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" ask, "What is God doing in this season?" Look at the isolation as a sacred pause, a moment where God is stripping away the noise to focus on you. Open his word and let it fill the silence. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." That stillness isn't a punishment, it's an invitation to experience him in a deeper way. Another way to embrace this process is by examining what God might be asking you to let go of. Are they habits, relationships, or even dreams that you've clung to more tightly than him? Like Gideon tearing down his family's altar to Baal, sometimes isolation is God's way of showing you what needs to be removed. It's painful, yes, but it's also freeing. Only when you let go of what divides you from God can you fully embrace his plan for you. And don't underestimate the power of prayer in this season. Isolation often feels like a void, but prayer fills it with purpose. When you pour out your heart to God, you're not just speaking into the air, you're aligning yourself with his will. Even when it feels like nothing is changing, trust that your prayers are part of his work in you. Finally, remember that isolation is temporary. Joseph's prison didn't last forever. Elijah didn't stay in the wilderness. Even Jesus' death was followed by resurrection. Your season of solitude is just that, a season. And like every season, it will pass, leaving behind a stronger, wiser, and more faithful version of you. So don't try to escape it. Don't try to fix what God is using to transform you. Lean into the stillness, let him work, and trust that your isolation is not a detour but a critical step in his redemption plan. Remember, your season of isolation is not the end, it's the beginning of a powerful transformation. Trust in God's purpose, embrace his timing, and let him work in the silence to prepare you for something greater. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep exploring these deep spiritual truths. Comment below with your thoughts or experiences. I'd love to hear from you.